Hi everyone. Um welcome to our book lunch. Book lunch for Guardianship and Democracy in Iran uh, and Turkey, tutelary consolidation, popular contestation, written by Karabekir Akkoyunlu. And this book is was published by Edinburgh University Press this year. And this event is organized by Political Science Association Turkish Specialist Group. And my friends, my colleagues are there, Begüm, Buğra, and Özlem. And some more friends online, I think. And I am Seçkin Sertdemir, Collegium Researcher at University of Turku and visiting fellow at LSE European Institute. Um, this event is, we are recording this event. I already started recording. And before presenting the schedule, I just want to introduce our panelists. First of all, Karabekir Akkoyunlu, he's a research associate in the Department of Politics and International Studies at SOAS University of London. His research engages with the literatures on democratization, autocratization, hybrid regimes, and civil-military relations. Our second panelist is Evren Balta. She is a professor of political science in the Department of International Relations at Özyeğin University and visiting scholar at Harvard's Weatherhead Center. She specializes in global order, citizenship, populism, and conflict. Our third panelist is Ali Alavi. He is a lecturer in Middle Eastern and Iranian studies in the School of Languages and Cultures and Linguistics, and co-director of Center for Iranian Studies at SOAS University of London. And his research portfolio spans the diverse realms of area studies, with particular focus on Asia, Middle East, and North Africa. Thank you for participating in this event. And here is the schedule. First of all, Karabekir will present his book in 15 minutes. Then Evren will provide us her feedback and comments. And after that, Ali will do the same. Each they will have 10 minutes. And after that, Karabekir will reply to all these comments in maximum, let's say, 10 minutes. Following that, we will have, Q&A session. So without further ado, let's start. The floor is yours, and I'm taking the timing, keeping the time, okay?
Thank you very much. Seçkin, Özlem, Begüm, Buğra, for your kind suggestion and also invitation to organize this book launch. And also thank you to my colleagues, Evren and Ali, for kindly accepting to read this book and also come here to comment about it. I actually still cannot believe that I'm at this stage where I'm launching this book and actually have the hard copy here by my side, because for a very long time it seemed like this wasn't going to happen. So let me tell you a little bit about the background of the book before I get into a little bit of an introduction about the book itself. This book is the outcome, the product of a very long, drawn-out story that spans about 15 years. It is an updated, revised, and patchworked version of what was once my PhD dissertation at the London School of Economics, which I completed a decade ago in 2014. And if there is anybody listening to this right now who is doing a PhD, who has recently finished and is wondering what to do with their dissertation, whether to work on it now for publication or wait a little bit because you cannot face the dissertation, my sincere suggestion is go for it, do not delay it. The more you delay it, the more complicated it becomes. And the ensuing decade that it took from submission to publication of this work is really a testament about the complexity of it. A lot has changed since I submitted my work, and now in terms of Iran and Turkey, maybe not so much fundamentally, but a lot of rethinking needed to go in. A lot changed in the world, but above all, there was a lot of personal change. There was a lot of personal change in terms of how I approach things, my methodological sort of knowledge. I started becoming a big critic of myself, and my focus shifted as well. So as I picked up the book in fits and pieces in different periods, it was a complex sort of endeavor, and I say this because I want to sort of talk a little, go beyond the veneer of this congratulatory rhetoric around publication in academic environments. We talk about, I'm delighted to say that I published this and that, but a lot of times the story that leads up to that is very, very painful. There's a lot of fits and starts, and so if there's anybody who is going through that kind of process of complex introspection, self-doubt, I would just want to say that you're not alone. You can get to it. Seek guidance, and perfect is the enemy of good. I am saying that in a sense, perhaps to preempt some of the criticisms that may come from the discussants, but it is the reality of academic publishing. But still, I'm actually quite happy that the book has come out when it has come out, because some of the reasons why I wrote it are so many years later still valid and relevant. I first became engaged in the concept of guardianship, and specifically Turkish and Iranian institutions and politics around regime guardianship towards the end of the 2000s, 2009, 2010 to be specific. I started reading to begin with immensely about Iran, Iranian history, politics, society. I visited Iran, started taking Persian courses at SOAS, and I realized that this curiosity, first of all, came from this under realization that, especially coming from a secular middle class Turkish background, our perceptions towards Iran have been sort of framed by this fear of Turkey one day becoming Iran. So everything we look towards Iran, everything we sort of associate with Iran, the Islamic Republic, has been from the perspective of dichotomies, black and white opposites. And when I read more into what was written, not just in Turkey, but about Turkey and Iran, which wasn't a lot, to be honest, I realized that this kind of knee-jerk dichotomies were actually quite prevalent, not only in journalistic and popular accounts, but also in scholarship, in social science scholarship. There wasn't a lot of comparative work between Turkey and Iran, but a lot of international relations work, and that seemed to take into take on board these caricaturized dichotomies of Turkey, especially since 1979. This dichotomy of Turkey as a pro-Western, secular, albeit flawed democracy on one side, and Iran, this anti-Western theocratic dictatorship that could not be reconciled or compared even in any way. Now, if you look at the history of the two countries, and even more, if you actually travel from one country to the other over land, you realize that this sort of opposition just doesn't make sense. There's so much continuity, there's so much parallel and shared history and culture that this type of simplistic dichotomy just didn't cut it for me, didn't satisfy my intellectual hunger. But also I realized when I started engaging in Iranian political debates, listening and observing them, that there were also a lot of parallels in the late 2000s, early 2010s. In both societies, the topics were revolving around democracy, reform, Islam and democracy, and reconciliation between the two. And at the center of them all, these institutions of regime guardianship that limited, defined the counters, the borders and rules of the game and what to do with these institutions. And to my surprise, there was pretty much no serious work, with the exception of one article and one book chapter that looked at these institutions of regime guardianship in an in-depth perspective. So the goal I set out with was to, first of all, overcome these simplistic and unhelpful dichotomies that pervaded Iranian and Turkish studies, and to unpack and explain the understudied institutional and political parallels, and of course differences between the Islamic Republic and the Turkish Republic, using guardianship and tutelary hybrid regime concept as my comparative framework. Over time, as I read more into the literature on hybrid regimes and guardianship, I also realized that Turkey and Iran could also provide an opportunity to deepen our understanding of this kind of regime type and the concept of guardianship. So the aims have been twofold. One, to deepen our understanding of Turkey and Iran through this comparative framework, but also through the case studies contribute to the growing literature on hybrid regimes and still understudied concept of guardianship or tutelage. So at the core of the book is the concept of guardianship. It's in the title and it runs through the book. Guardianship, velayet in Iran, vesayet in Turkey, all coming from Arabic, whether it's custodianship, guardianship, or velayet, vesayet, all have technical legal meanings. Legal guardianship implies having a supervisory, a legal responsibility, supervisory role and legal responsibility over individuals who are unable to take care of their own affairs, right? So it is the relationship between the parent and the child, guardian and the minor, teacher and the student, tutor and the tutee. So, and the political application of the use of guardianship, of the term of guardianship, is extrapolated from this legal use. And this is done in many ways explicitly. So, for instance, Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran said that there's no difference between the guardian of a nation and the guardian of a minor. I mean, his velayet faqih thesis takes on the traditional role of the clergy as the guardian of the dispossessed and basically zooms out and enlarges it to make a political system out of it. In certain ways, Mustafa Kemal's idea of guardianship, or the Kemalist idea of guardianship, reflects that as well. Mustafa Kemal talks about holding the nation by the hand to achieve our revolution, like you would hold your child. So whether it's the legal or political definition, the concept of guardianship has a patriarchal relationship built into it. It is an infantilizing notion, but it is not a concept that implies complete domination, total control of one over the other. It is a supervisory notion. So you're not completely taking over the faculties of the other person, but you're overseeing them as they develop into something ideal. And that's the kind of idea that goes into political guardianship. And unless in the legal term, the person is permanently incapacitated, guardianship is meant to be a temporary idea, a transitory idea, progressive in a sense idea. So the minor grows up to be an adult and no longer needs the parents' supervision. The student graduates and no longer needs the tuition. In that sense, a lot of systems of guardianship, especially those that are associated with the modernization paradigm of the 20th century, have this progressive idea that suggests one day the responsibility of the guardians will end because the society that they've been looking after have reached a certain level of maturity. That's not really always the case. There are permanent aspects. Guardians often outstay their welcome. They turn into permanent mechanisms of power preservation. But the way it's conceptualized at the outset matters. In the case of Iran, for instance, it was conceptualized as a permanent sort of institutional arrangement until at least the arrival of the Mahdi. There was no expectation that the society would reach a level of perfection that the leader, the supreme leader, represented for us. So that's something important that, if I have time, I would like to get back to. Something that I also underline in the book is that the concept of guardianship and the kind of tutelary hybrid regimes I'm looking into, these are not some versions of Oriental despotism. These are not some type of Oriental sort of exotic, political manifestations. They're actually institutional and political actors and dynamics which are quite familiar to those of us who live in modern representative systems, which have some sort of institution or logic of guardianship built into them. And these institutions, actors, or logics of guardianship are becoming more and more explicit, obvious, as liberal democracies are faced with illiberal democratic components or challenges, or the elitist aspect of liberal democracy gives rise to the sort of populist reaction that emphasizes the establishment versus people dichotomy. So what I realize is that by looking at cases like Turkey and Iran, where the relationship between tutelary institutions and actors and democratic representative institutions and actors that actually operate within them, we can see some of these dynamics that are also in certain ways subtly present in representative regimes in more clear ways. So studying Turkey and Iran isn't just an Oriental interest, but actually gives us an insight into a wider sort of constellation of regimes, which also underlines the importance of distinguishing between what we call democratic checks and balances from non-accountable, undemocratic tutelary mechanisms. It's sort of a fine line which is blurred by the populist discourse of the establishment versus the people nowadays. So the book, in my last few minutes, conceptualizes Turkey and Iran as tutelary hybrid regimes. I actually wanted to say tutelary democracy at the early stages, but I had a lot of pushback from referees and reviewers. And I settled on tutelary hybrid regime, despite the clunkier sounding version of it. It wasn't the hill I wanted to die on, so to speak. Conceptualizes Turkey and Iran as tutelary hybrid regimes, as regimes that have dual sources of legitimacy. Republican, electoral, competitive pillar that coexist with these guardianship pillar actors that represent the interests of the people, claim to represent the interests of the people in the name of a particular ideology. And the book has this longue durée approach to analyzing political change, which is no longer very popular in social sciences. Again, I had a lot of methodological sort of questions about what I did and what I would do if I were to do this again. It's an in-depth narrative account of change and permanence in Iran and Turkey. I start with an evaluation of the symbols and perceptions of legitimate authority in the two countries, then move on to a comparison between the founding fathers of the two republics, Atatürk and Khomeini, which is controversial in many ways, but I think is also needed because we're looking at two charismatic leaders who put an end to millennia-old monarchical systems and established republics with a transformative mission. So I look at the comparison there. And then what happened institutionally and politically to these regimes once the charismatic leaders passed away, the intra-elite rivalries, factional divisions, and the populist contestation of guardianship, until the 21st century, when the sort of foundational tension of these regimes, the elite versus popular idea, became the defining political cleavage of national politics in Iran and in Turkey. So just give me a couple of more minutes and I'll finish. Because I'm basically coming to the end of the book as well. The idea is that these simultaneous power struggles in Turkey and Iran from the late 1990s until the 2010s ended in divergent outcomes. Whereas in Turkey, Kemalist guardianship was dismantled. In Iran, the traditional guardians were able to suppress populist challengers, but at the expense of the democratic legitimacy of the Islamic Republic. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. If you went back to the late 1990s, you could say that in terms of reconciling Islam, democracy, and doing away with guardianship through reform, you might have said that Khatemi's Iran may have held more promise than the Turkey of 28th February coup process, but things evolved in certain ways that this outcome emerged. And then the book ends with a consideration of what explains these divergent outcomes. It's something that I would love to get into, but I'm not going to talk about, just to say that it's a matter of, it's a combination of structure and agency-related factors that explains these divergent outcomes. That has to do with the way guardianship was established in the two countries. It also has to do with the geopolitics of the two countries, which has an impact on both, but also how human agency, political actors dealt with these critical junctures, whether they seized the opportunities or not, and whether the guardians ended up being divided or united at the expense of, in the face of these confrontations and challenges. So I'll stop with that, and I'm looking forward to Evren and Ali's assessments, and I'm happy to sort of answer everybody's questions.
Thank you for this brief introduction. To shed more light on the book, let's hear from our next panelist, Evren. The mic is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Karabekir, for suggesting me to comment on this really magnificent book. So when reading your book, I felt a deep sympathy. You started with a personal history, and I thought I should start with my personal history as well. And I felt really a deep sympathy and strong connection to your challenges, you described as challenges. My dissertation was also a comparative analysis of Turkey and Russia in terms of managing Kurdish and Chechen insurgencies. And I defended my dissertation in 2007. It has yet to be transformed into a book, and I feel empathy to that as well. But during the writing process, I have encountered too many objections, people often questioning the validity or fairness of such comparisons. And it really increases if you have two cases. It's more difficult because you need to generalize enough, but not to an extent that you don't have the details of the cases lost in the generalization. But I do think that you basically are able to do that, and it really is a magnificent contribution in that sense. You have a general analytical argument that really connects to these two cases, and you are able to give a lot of detail both on Iran and Turkey in a way that you accurately represent your cases that you are basically comparing. So I do think that this book really enriches our understanding, and it is a remarkable contribution to the literature on authoritarianism and democratization. And I do think that it does so by challenging these traditional binaries of democratic authoritarian regimes, by, as you were saying, exploring the hybrid nature of these systems. It, as I said, deepens our understanding of Iran and Turkey, and also contributes to the global debates on democratic erosion, rise of populism, the tension between elite control and popular sovereignty. And it's also a fresh perspective in addition to the literature and on competitive authoritarianism. So you're basically, I do think that contributing this emerging literature on the mixed nature of the authoritarian and also democratic regimes, not just authoritarian regimes, but we do have the similar tendencies in the democratic regimes as well. I have some questions, 5 major questions actually, but these are basically not a criticism, questions that I would like you to further enlighten us. As I said, okay, let me start with the questions. So the first one is about the elections. So I do see that your treatment of elections underscores the critical role of elections in hybrid regimes. On the one hand, you have controlled elections like those in Iran primarily serve as a mechanism to legitimize guardianship and regulating the competition to prevent meaningful change while allowing factional disputes within elite boundaries. In contrast, Turkey, and you basically argue that, have more contested electoral history, even under military tutelage, enabled genuine opposition victories and shifts in political power, fostering a dynamic interplay between democratic and tutelary elements. My question is this, while you highlight these dynamics, you do not seem to me fully integrate this distinction into your theoretical framework, leaving me wondering how electoral contestation impacts the evolution of tutelary regimes. Does the nature of elections, as you were saying, controlled versus contested, fundamentally shape the adaptability, legitimacy, and resilience of this sort of tutelary hybrid regimes? My second question is about ideology. You write a lot on that as well. And in Turkey, you have guardianship that was anchored in the Kemalist vision of secular modernization, emphasizing westernization and national unity. In Iran, it was built upon religiously driven, anti-Western vision of Islamic State, and you have all these elements. And this ideological grounding, as you were also showing, basically influenced the legitimacy of guardianship, but it also shaped its resonance with society, its ability to withstand pressures for change and this and that. So my question here is that, how does the ideological foundation of guardianship affect its adaptability? Or more specifically, does a secular modernist framework like Turkey's offer greater flexibility for reform compared to religious ideological one, such as in Iran's? My third question is about this diverging paths. So you basically, in the conclusion and in the last part of the book, focus on the consolidation of authoritarianism in Iran and Turkey. And I do think that the consolidation of authoritarianism in the 21st century in Iran and in Turkey have really striking parallels, despite their different cultural and historical contexts. In both in Iran and Turkey, we have, and let me say differently, the comparison of not Khomeini and Atatürk, but comparison of Erdogan and Khomeini in a way. Both leaders challenged the elite-driven modernization projects by framing their movements as authentic movements against the top-down reforms. Both of them are basically opposed, for example, Erdogan opposed to Kemalist secularism, mobilizing conservative groups. And in the case of Iran, Khomeini resisted Shah's secular pro-Western modernization. In the case of Iran, Khomeini embedded Shia Islam into Iran's political identity, while Erdogan leveraged Sunni Islam to unite conservative populations against Turkey's secular military bureaucratic establishment. Both relied on their charisma to frame themselves as the saviors of the real people. Khomeini led the Iranian Revolution as reclaiming of Iran from an illegitimate foreign-supported regime, while Erdogan presented himself as liberating Turkey from the deep state, privileged Kemalist elite, this and that. So why not compare in depth Khomeini and Erdogan? Or let me ask differently. How do these shared strategies, populism, religious mobilization, charismatic leadership, shape the long-term stability and adaptability of these two regimes? What I'm asking, I guess, is that you focus on divergence, but it seems to me that their diverging paths once again collided in the 21st century in another way. So maybe you can explore on that a little bit as well. My fourth question is about the institutionalization of the Turkish military guardianship, and you basically focus on this a lot in the book as well. So the military's role, overall guardianship role, began with the 1960 coup, and you were alluding on that, and the subsequent interventions of 1971 and 1980s, which really institutionalized the National Security Council as a central mechanism of control. But I am basically wondering, why do you, I mean, it seems to me that after 1980, Turkey's tutelary regime was institutionalized enough. So could you elaborate why you view the military's role in Turkey as ad hoc, despite this institutional transformation? So that was another question. And my final question is that, did you consider the concept of neo-patrimonialism in comparing these two regimes? Or why didn't you choose not to engage more deeply with neo-patrimonialism as a conceptual framework? Because again, going back to my third question, in terms of overlapping dynamics in both Iranian and Turkish regimes, we do see more of a shift to a more personalized and a less institutionally constrained forms of governance, both in terms of distribution of rents and this and that. So, I mean, with that, I will stop. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for your, valuable insights and 5 relevant questions. And now, could you, Dr. Ali, can you share your comments and feedback with us, please?
Thank you very much. So while my colleague Evren was posing those questions, I had to recalibrate my questions because some of them were sharing. So Karabekir, I should say I really enjoyed reading this book. And what captivates my interest in this book is the discussion on the notion of guardianship within two neighboring Muslim nations, characterized by different political framework. Literally, the beauty of it, from my point of view, is that you are making a comparative analysis of the guardianship of two different figures. The beauty of it is actually did it between the Kemal Atatürk, Mustafa Kemal, and Khomeini, rather than two Islamic oriented leaders. So one with a secular orientation and one with Islamic. So that actually makes it even more interesting to me. Yeah, you lucidly argue that the Republic of Turkey and the Islamic Republic of Iran, custodial bodies and democratic institutions are coexisted in a hybrid manner. But then at some point, when we say coexisted, they're actually clashing as well, the concept of guardianship in both states. So, the chronology of the book is very interesting. The table helps the reader to navigate easily, and these are very important points and quite readable. So I should say congratulations, Karabekir, for such a good work that makes the reader to enjoy. I have 5 questions. I don't know what's happening with the number 5, but I have also 5 questions. But feel free to answer any if you wish. So one is the concept of guardianship. The concept of guardianship in Iran, as you mentioned in your book, originated from Khomeini, who theorized it in his book before the revolution. So Velayat-e Faqih, Islamic governance, So that book served as a foundational blueprint for the guardianship. However, Mustafa Kemal's ideas were not theorized, literally mainly influenced by the 1920s and 30s of modernism in Europe. And and then later, the concept of guardianship was not theorized by him, but rather interpreted and understood by his followers, all the army generals, all those who claimed to be his followers in order to monopolize the power. So how can we reconcile the concept of theorizing the guardianship? I wonder. The second question is, you mentioned that in the Ottoman Empire, with now the Turkey, they're inheriting that part in that region. Sunni Islamic thought was institutionalized during the Ottoman, and then in Iran during the Safavid, the Shia. So I was trying to navigate that now in today, because even though some claim that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was purely believed in laicite, but you could see the Ottoman flag remained, which is actually the symbol of Sunni Islam by the Atatürk himself. So there's a question: to what extent Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was fully secular, and to what extent Khomeini was fully Islamist, because you could see some secularism in it, secularization of the Shia Islam. So my question was on that element: to what extent the Sunni faith affects today's Turkey in post-Atatürk and during Atatürk till today in forging Turkish identity, of course, but we can see that, trace it easier in Iran, because it returned back by Khomeini Shia Islam as that concept. So these are the two questions. The third question is on what do you think of this? I was trying to find out, but you mentioned that interestingly, you have a movements in Turkey and Iran in parallel that try to moderate that guardianship. So in the Iranian context, you have reformers, which are leaning slightly towards secularism. But interestingly, in Turkey, the groups that they try to moderate and reduce the absolutism of guardianships are actually from less secular movements, such as AKP party and the other groups that are less secular. So you see in a totally different directions that both are actually trying to moderate that absolutism, but one from secular leaning and one from less secular leaning, which is the AKP party in that case. And then the last question is, the concept of guardianship was also done to introduce the governance in both states, one in a different concept, the other in a different concept, to redefine the identity of the state. But then there are some things that those guardianship governance had to face, which was the minorities within the countries. In Turkey, which is a Kurdish minority, actually are the same as Turkish majority. Both majority of the Turks and the Kurds together subscribe to Sunni Islam. Whereas in Iran, you have a different minorities. We have a variety of minorities. But for example, the Kurdish question in Iran is different in Turkey. The Kurds are majority, not all, Sunnis in Iran, whereas the Azeri Turks are Shias and the Persians are Shias. So the guardianship in Iran tried to reformulate the concept of minorities through the faith and religion. In Turkey, through the concept of language. how the guardianship were trying to define that as well. These are the points that I was trying to navigate. You mentioned that at some point, but I just wanted to know what are your thoughts on these points.
Thank
But
you.
again, congratulations. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you. Thank you, Ali, for your valuable insights and questions. Karabekir, you have 10 questions and great feedbacks, and you will have only 10 minutes to reply to all of these questions. But before you start, just I want to tell the attendees that if you want to ask questions, please raise your hand, or you can write your question on the in the question and Q&A section. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you both to Evren and Ali, first of all, for the kind words. Until the book is showcased, one doesn't know what to make of it. Even if you have had friends reading them, it's a different thing to actually have genuine reactions. So it's encouraging to hear the positive responses and reactions. But I'm also, thankful for the questions, the critical sort of approaches, which also shows me that, some of the topics, some of the themes that I wanted to dig into have generated thought. So, whether it's elections or ideology or the sort of the sectarian aspect of, there are a lot of questions that obviously have that can take us to these sub-discussions around this big topic of guardianship and tutelage in Iran and Turkey. So let me, I'm not sure I'm going to go with, the order of questions as they were presented, but I'll try to link some of those. So one thing that Evren said connects with Ali's comment. Evren mentioned the consolidation of, well, why don't we do an Erdogan-Khomeini comparison? Which is more sort of it's from that Islamic reformist or revolutionary perspective, dealing with the secular sort of background, secular regime, and changing it. I think this is totally doable. When I started working on it, it didn't strike me as the comparative framework that one could. It wasn't the pressing comparative framework. Let me put it that way. I can think about an Erdogan Khomeini a comparison as a sort of follow-up to this work. First of all, I thought that whether the secular or Islamic, the tutelary aspect of the two republics, the two regimes, had to be studied and analyzed. But also, I mean, I started working on this in 2009. It was difficult to compare Erdogan to Khomeini in 2009, 2010, 2012, 2013, when I actually did most of my write-up. Obviously I went back to it, but I didn't. And in the Atatürk-Khomeini comparison and the Turkish Republic versus Islamic Republic comparison, I saw an inherent potential for understanding something core about these regimes that had to be analyzed, and that sort of links me with what Ali was saying about the differences. So the comparative framework is not all about similarities. It's setting up a framework so that we can both tease out parallels, but also make more sense of the differences. And so, for instance, Mustafa Kemal and Khomeini as two leaders of charismatic leaders of popular movements leading their countries into a new regime, it gives us a framework to also look at the way that the two regimes evolved differently later on. And Ali, you're spot on to say that Khomeini had a more clear theoretical blueprint than Mustafa Kemal. I actually say this in the book, that if Khomeini was ambivalent about what he had in mind for the post-revolutionary Iran, Mustafa Kemal was fully silent about it, and he never really theorized. I mean, Kemalism was theorized after Mustafa Kemal, when it started to be theorized in his final days, and then it was really trying to sort of claim the legitimacy of the charismatic leader that the Republican Party tried to sort of create an ism out of what Mustafa Kemal had created, also in the context of the rising totalitarian fascist movements of the time. But that, I think, is also illuminating in comparing and contrasting the way the two regimes sort of evolved. I think so. This is what I meant by Turkish system of guardianship evolving in an ad hoc way. So, Evren, you're right that it was firmly institutionalized in 1980 and 1982, but I didn't want to start the story there. I mean, I could sort of claim Evren as the founding sort of father of the new Turkish Republic. He wanted to sort of, Kenan Evren, the junta leader of the 1980 coup, he fashioned himself as a second coming of Atatürk. But of course, the references were harking back at the sort of Kemalist legacy of the Turkish Republic and some of the institutional predecessors or the institutional background of what enabled the post-1980-82 and hardening of the tutelary system had to be explained by going back in time as well. But what's clear is that the way guardianship evolved in Turkey did not happen as explicitly, as deliberately as in Iran, even though a lot changed in Iran as well after the passing of Khomeini, right? I mean, the Guardian Council became much more stronger. The supreme leaders' powers were articulated much more explicitly. So change happened in Iran as well, but Khomeini was there at the inception, laying the blueprint of the Velayet-i Faqih system. It was his idea. That gave legitimacy, at least constitutional legitimacy and political legitimacy, for the forces of the Islamic Republic, the guardianship institutions and the actors to go at greater lengths at protecting the regime, including in terms of exerting violence and coercion. This was, the Turkish system of guardianship was legitimized as a response to changing geopolitical dynamics in the context of the Cold War, and always had to be justified with response to existing sort of threats to the Republic, always trying to claim legitimacy and justification from Mustafa Kemal, but not really being able to point out to his laws or his words that set up the system. And ultimately, I argue at the end of the book, this is one of the reasons why, when a majority of the population wanted change, Turkey's institutional and international partners supported it. The elites, the ideology, the tutelary elites in Turkey became divided, and they could not prevent change from happening. So I think, in terms of presenting a contrast, the difference between the establishment and consolidation of the Turkish system of guardianship and the Iranian one is something I welcome, and I think it's something that is worth getting into detail about. Evren, you asked about the sort of critical importance of elections, but how they're different for both countries. I think something, again, this follows a little bit from how to theorize or how to sort of justify the differences. But I think the way I would sort of again answer this question is, once we draw the comparative framework around tutelary hybrid regimes that are consisting of these dual pillars of legitimacy and dual institutional pillars of guardianship and republicanism or democracy, whose frontiers are always in flux and they sort of vacillate, and there's always this sort of like confrontation and contestation, we can account for differences. We can account for a different balance between the two institutions. I mean, I also mentioned in the very beginning that some political scientists labeled Iran as an illiberal tutelary hybrid regime and Turkey as a liberal one at the sort of in the early 2000s. I didn't want to get too much into that kind of distinction. But yes, the fact that Turkey allowed for a greater electoral competition clearly had both a legitimizing but also transformative effect. But ultimately, whether it is for Iran or Turkey, for the Guardians, elections were the sine qua non. They needed to have elections. And I think sometimes there's a risk of underestimating how much of a risk elections contained for Guardians in both polities, including in Iran as well, that there were unpredictable aspects of competitive competition and competitive elections. They were not completely 100% managed and preordained outcomes in the Iranian elections. Oftentimes, I mean, actually, pretty much all the time, except for the last elections, the candidates least favored by the traditionalist Guardians won, just like in Turkey, the candidates least favored by the Guardians, the generals in Turkey, won out. And they had to deal with that. They had to contend with that. The Iranians, because they had the sort of the velayat faqih as a guardianship sort of framework explicitly put in the constitution, and because they had less pressure from international sort of entanglements, whether they were macroeconomic or institutional, Turkey being part of NATO and Iran not having those kind of sovereignty reducing commitments, and of course Iran being a rentier state and having its own sort of sources of material funding, which Turkey lacked, the Iranian regime was able to go down the path of constraining their competitive space further than the Turkish Guardians ever actually imagined to do. So, but they found along the way other novel ways of overthrowing governments if they needed to. I mean, 1997, the 28th February process is one example of it. The Turkish postmodern guardianship was actually about linking up with the sort of global change in the world and justifying this anti-Islamic sort of interventionism on the basis of some neoliberal framework. The Turkish Guardians were very creative in that aspect, but that hit a wall with the AKP in the 2000s. And that also sort of leads to your question about ideology, how much of, how ideology affects the durability of the regimes. I think, again, in the Turkish case, what we see is that yes, it's secular versus Islamic framework, and this is important, but also there's a lot of fluidity. There's a lot of fluidity and a lot of sort of discursive acrobacy to justify very different viewpoints in the words of Kemalist secularism or Khomeinist sort of Islamic system. And we could say that in Turkey, the sort of more background character of the tutelary regime allowed for more diversity of ideological interpretation of Kemalism over the years, many years after the leader died. But let's not forget that it was also the same Guardians who very much put forward what we call the Turkish Islamic synthesis at the same time, as the Iranian Revolution was happening in 1980s. So the same secular Guardians were able to promote a nationalist version of Islam, in the context of the geopolitics of the 1980s, and so I think there's both in terms of elections and ideology, we need to hit a sweet spot. There's a risk in overstating their importance. There's a sort of risk in determinism, in saying, in basically coming down to black and white type of opposition. But also we cannot neglect that they have certain path-dependent elements. So the fact that Turkey is modernizing secular ideology could actually outstay the it can maintain a certain relevance beyond Atatürk and Kemalism. Let's put it that way. It can be put in new boxes. Whether Velayet-i Faqih can survive the Islamic Republic or Khomeini's legacy is, I think, a bigger question. So in that sense, you know, for instance, now Kemalist guardianship has been dismantled in terms of its institutional framework, but Atatürk is still very, very popular in Turkey, right? So that sort of, I think, shows the flexibility of the Turkish regime. And that leads me to Ali's question about, you know, the Sunni versus Shia, to what extent Mustafa Kemal was really secular, where, you know, the impact of Sunni Islam. I'd like to point out that the Ottoman flag that Turkey inherited was actually borrowed from the Byzantines. I mean, the original flag of crescent and star is a Byzantine flag. So there is actually continuity that dates back, and I talk about it in that first chapter. Ottoman Empire inherits a lot from the Byzantine Empire, and Turkey also inherits a lot from the Ottoman Empire. And you know, and we need to look at it, of course, in the context of Sunni Islam and other sort of identity tags, but also beyond that, it is about how the state power is formulated, and that there is a sort of continuity in the case of Turkey when we look at that. And I think in certain ways in Iran as well, there's a sense of continuity. Ideological change sometimes conceals the way power arrangements are formulated, and in both cases, pre and post-revolution, or and transformation, continuities are very important. So I try to sort of emphasize that with that longue durée history as well. I mean, the fact that the personalized nature of the regime in Iran, that it persisted, or also the themes of, you know, resistance against tyranny, justice-based divine sort of ordainment. These have been persistent themes in Iran as well. So I think while Sunnism and Shiism had a role in consolidating a type of relationship between state and religion, which are important, the kind of approaches to state authority predate these Sunni Shia divisions and have had, you know, a continuity from early modern, pre-modern to early modern to modern configurations. I don't think I've answered everything, and I've sort of gone off the tangents as well. I've avoided the question on neo-patrimonialism because I think you're right. I talk about patriarchal authority and Weber's concept of patriarchal authority, which I think is inherent in concept of tutelage. And I think this is very much something that has been a mainstay of Turkish politics. And more so in the current configuration, where whole power has become more and more personalized under Erdogan. So this is one of the emphasis that I try to make in the book as well. One of the key sort of critical points, and this is my last sort of response, you know, that we talk about continuities between Ottoman Empire to Kemalist Turkey and its changes, and from the old Turkey to new Turkey. But one key change, if it persists, is debureaucratization of state authority. So what we see is a process of bureaucratization that leads well into the 20th century, late 20th century. And of course, you have these individual leaders, but bureaucracy is always there. And under Erdogan, I think this is changing. And that reminds me of Khomeini's, you know, Khamenei's Iran more than anything. The sort of personalized nature of power, the personal loyalties, families getting involved, and these cliques. So in that sense, I think there is a sort of novel neo-patrimonial comparison to be made between 21st century Iran and Turkey. Sorry for rambling, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you.